You'll never be good enough for my daughter!
Are you going to say anything?
Malcolm, just go home.
Hello? Don't sign anything.
Tom's left you authority over the deal she's trying to sell.
You'll never be good enough for my daughter. Vivian Whitmore said it close enough for me to smell the champagne on her breath. Then her palm cracked across my cheek beneath 3 crystal chandeliers. Nearly 200 people watched. My wife, Simone, stood beside her mother and did not move. 20 minutes later, Vivian's own lawyer called me. For a few seconds, the annual Whitmore Foundation dinner went completely silent. My left ear rang, and the skin along my cheek felt hot enough to pulse. Cameras lowered. Forks stopped against plates. Simone tightened one hand around her champagne glass, staring at me as if the unbearable part of the scene was not what her mother had done, but that everyone had seen it. I did not raise my voice or touch Vivian. I only asked Simone, "Are you going to say anything?" Her eyes moved from my face to the donors around us. Then to her mother. "Malcolm, just go home," she said. Something in me went quiet. The slap had hurt for seconds. That answer told me my marriage had been choosing a side for far longer. I walked out through the conservatory doors with applause starting behind me for an auction item nobody had been listening to. I had made it halfway across the parking court when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Martin Shaw, the attorney who had represented Vivian and the Whitmore family for more than 20 years. I nearly let it go to voicemail. When I answered, Martin did not ask how I was. He said, "Malcolm, do not sign anything Vivian gives you tonight, and do not leave Charlotte." I stopped beside my truck. Then he said the sentence that changed the shape of the evening. "Her husband left you authority over the one thing she is trying to sell." If you are wondering why a woman who had just slapped me in public could have a lawyer calling to protect me from her, I was wondering the same thing. To understand it, I have to go back 9 years, before the ballroom, before the merger documents, and before Simone learned to look at my work boots the way her mother always had. I built East Line Restoration with 2 borrowed trucks, a 4-man crew, and more confidence than cash. We restored schools, churches, warehouses, and old apartment buildings that larger firms considered too complicated or too small to matter. I spent my 20s learning how to save structures people had already decided were disposable, and the habit stayed with me. By the time I met Simone Whitmore, Eastline had 37 employees and contracts across 3 counties. I was not poor, and I was not pretending to be. I simply did not live like the Whitmores. Their name was attached to hotels, office towers, a private foundation, and half the plaques hanging in the museums where Charlotte held its most expensive parties. Simone never seemed impressed by any of that when we first started dating. She came to one of my renovation sites in white sneakers, ruined them before lunch, and laughed about it all the way home. She liked the fact that I knew every foreman by name. I liked that she asked questions about old buildings instead of asking how much the contracts were worth. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, surprised me. He had spent 40 years turning a regional property company into Whitmore Heritage Group, but he still walked construction sites without an entourage and asked superintendents about drainage before he asked executives about returns. The first time we met, he stayed with my crew for 2 hours and ate barbecue from a paper tray. Vivian was different. She was gracious in the way a locked door can be polished. She never insulted me directly in those early years. She asked where I had gone to school, then repeated the name as though trying to place a restaurant she had once driven past. She called Eastline your little restoration company long after our annual revenue had passed $40 million. I told myself none of that mattered because Simone loved me. For a while, I believe she did in a way that was simple and uncalculated. We married in the garden behind Thomas and Vivian's house. Thomas gave a short toast about foundations, not the financial kind, and said a building only lasts when people respect what they cannot see beneath it. 3 years into our marriage, Thomas asked Eastline to take on a difficult project for Whitmore Heritage, 12 aging apartment buildings in South End that had been neglected for decades. The board wanted to demolish them and replace them with luxury units. Thomas wanted to preserve the brick shells, repair the interiors, and keep a third of the rents below market. The numbers were ugly. I told him that on the first day, he said he already knew and asked whether ugly meant impossible. I told him no, just honest. We spent 18 months rebuilding those properties without displacing a single tenant. The project barely made Eastline a profit, but Thomas called it the best thing his company had done in 10 years. Vivian thought the opposite. At a board dinner, I heard her tell Thomas that he was confusing sentiment with strategy. Thomas answered that strategy without memory was just appetite wearing a tie. I pretended not to hear them. It was not my family argument. And at that point, I had no reason to think it would ever become my problem. Thomas died 2 years later after a sudden stroke. He was 71. The funeral filled a cathedral. And I spent most of that day holding Simone's hand while Vivian moved through receiving lines with the rigid control of someone who had decided grief would have to wait until everyone else went home. Afterward, the Whitmore family changed quickly. Vivian became executive chair. Simone moved from the foundation into corporate strategy. A man named Grant Ellison, who had advised the company during Thomas's final year, became chief development officer. He was polished, patient, and extremely good at turning every conversation into a reason the company needed to become larger than it had been the day before. Simone began using the same language at home. She stopped asking me whether a renovation could work and started asking why I kept wasting time on buildings that would never photograph well in investor decks. She wanted Eastline to bid on luxury towers. I told her I preferred projects where the work still mattered after the ribbon-cutting photos disappeared. We did not fight about money. We fought about what money was for. The distinction sounds philosophical until it follows you into your kitchen every night. Simone thought I was stubborn because I would not chase prestige contracts. I thought she was changing because every decision suddenly needed an audience wealthy enough to approve of it. I let most of it pass. That was one of my mistakes. Silence can look like strength from the inside while everyone around you is learning that there is no cost for crossing a line. I told myself that responding to every insult would make me insecure. What I did not see was that refusing to name disrespect was teaching Simone to treat it as normal. The first real warning came when Eastline received a confidential request for pricing on a Whitmore portfolio sale. 12 properties were being packaged together, including the South End buildings Thomas and I had rebuilt. The buyer was a private fund called North Lake Urban Partners. The offer was far below what the properties were worth if they remained occupied. I called Simone and asked whether she knew. She paused just long enough to answer the question before she said yes. According to her, the sale would free capital for a luxury resort acquisition in Charleston. I reminded her that Thomas had put long-term affordability covenants on 4 of the properties. She said the legal team had found a path around that. I asked for the sale documents because Eastline still held warranty obligations on 3 buildings. Simone told me not to make this personal. I said it had become personal the moment her family asked me to help preserve a neighborhood and then quietly designed a deal to erase the promise. That was the first time she accused me of thinking I knew her father better than she did. 2 days later, Grant called and invited me to lunch. He spoke for 20 minutes about scale, market cycles, and the danger of becoming emotionally attached to assets. Then he slid a consulting agreement across the table. Whitmore Heritage would pay Eastline $3 million to supervise the transition after the sale, provided I signed a confidentiality clause and waived objections. I read the agreement twice. The money was real, and Eastline could have used it. We were carrying 2 school projects with delayed municipal payments and a hospital renovation that had expanded beyond the original scope. I pushed the agreement back. Grant smiled and said, "You know, Malcolm, there is a difference between having principles and knowing when they have become expensive." I told him principles were only principles when they cost something. He stopped smiling. That afternoon, Simone called me furious. Grant had told her I embarrassed him and threatened a transaction that had already been presented to lenders. I asked why my wife was defending a man who had tried to buy my silence. She said because he understood the world she was trying to build. We slept in separate rooms that night. 3 days later, Vivian sent an engraved invitation to the Whitmore Foundation dinner, followed by a second envelope containing a postnuptial agreement. The document limited any marital claim I might have against Simone's future trust distributions and required me to waive rights connected to Whitmore family entities, whether known or unknown. I called Simone and asked whether she had read it. She said her mother insisted everyone in the family update their estate planning before the North Lake transaction. I asked why the agreement included language about voting rights, indemnification, and unknown fiduciary interests. Simone said I was being dramatic and told me to sign it so we could stop fighting. I sent the document to my attorney, Denise Carter. She called within an hour and told me not to sign a word. The waiver was broader than anything she had seen in an ordinary postnuptial agreement. It did not merely protect Simone's inheritance. It appeared designed to make me disclaim any present or future authority connected to several Whitmore trusts. That made no sense. I had no authority over any Whitmore trust that I knew of. Denise requested the referenced schedules from Vivian's counsel. No one sent them. Instead, Martin Shaw called her office and said the schedules were not applicable. Denise asked him to put that statement in writing. He refused, which told her the omission was not accidental. I attended the foundation dinner because Simone asked me to. She said we needed one evening where we looked like a married couple instead of two attorneys exchanging documents through us. I told her looking married was not the same as being married. She said, "Then show me you still want to be." I wanted to believe that meant something. The conservatory was full by the time we arrived. Vivian wore deep burgundy and moved through the room with the confidence of someone who had spent decades assuming every door would open before she reached it. Grant was never far away. The North Lake representatives occupied a private table near the stage, though the transaction had not yet been announced publicly. Halfway through dinner, Martin approached me with a leather folder. He looked uncomfortable. Vivian joined him before he could speak and told me there was one final signature needed before Monday's board meeting. I opened the folder and found the same postnuptial agreement, this time marked with colored tabs. I closed it and handed it back. Vivian's smile stayed in place. "Do not make a scene," she said. I told her I was not the one handing marital waivers across a charity dinner table. Grant stepped closer. Simone whispered my name like a warning. I asked Vivian why the agreement required me to surrender authority nobody had ever told me I possessed. That was when her expression changed. She said Thomas had indulged me when he was alive and that I had mistaken his affection for standing. I asked again what authority the document was trying to remove. Vivian told me to sign it and stop pretending I belonged in decisions above my station. I said, quietly, "If the document is harmless, then tell me what it does." The slap came on the next breath. There was no argument after it. Only that bright sound under the chandeliers and Vivian's voice telling me I would never be good enough for her daughter. I looked at Simone, waiting for the smallest sign that 9 years of marriage mattered more than one room full of donors. She asked me to leave. That was the moment something inside me stopped negotiating. I walked out, answered Martin's call in the parking court, and listened while the man who had spent 20 years protecting Vivian Whitmore told me Thomas had built a legal trap around the very transaction she was trying to force through for weeks. Martin asked whether I remembered the South End Preservation Project. I said of course I did. He told me Thomas had amended the Whitmore Legacy Trust 6 months after that project closed. The trust held 52% of Whitmore Heritage Group's voting stock, and Thomas had created a special office called Independent Steward for any sale involving protected community assets. The appointment was dormant unless 3 conditions occurred together: a sale of designated properties, a waiver aimed at stewardship rights, and a board vote within 15 days. The trust company's monitoring council had received the waiver request directly from Martin's office, so activation did not depend on Vivian admitting what she intended. All 3 conditions were now documented. I asked Martin whether Vivian knew my name was in the amendment. He said she knew an independent steward clause existed, but Thomas had sealed the identity of the appointee with an outside fiduciary firm. Vivian believed Thomas had selected a retired judge. Martin had learned the truth only that afternoon when the firm released the activation packet. Then Martin said something that made the slap feel smaller and the room behind me feel more dangerous. As independent steward, I had the authority to suspend the sale for 30 days, compel production of internal valuation records, and call a special shareholder review. I did not own the trust. I could not take its money. but I could stop the transaction cold. I asked why Thomas would give that authority to me. Martin said the sealed packet included a letter answering exactly that question, but he was not permitted to open it until I accepted the appointment. I looked through the glass doors at the ballroom where Simone and Vivian were still inside. Then I asked Martin where I needed to sign. We met at his office at 11 that night. Denise joined by video. The appointment papers were narrow and specific, which I appreciated. I could only act on transactions involving the protected portfolio, conflicts of interest, or attempts to alter the stewardship clause. Every action had to be documented and could be reviewed by the court supervising the trust. I signed the acceptance, and Martin opened Thomas's letter. It was handwritten on the yellow legal paper he used during site walks. He wrote that wealth made families good at protecting ownership and sometimes terrible at protecting purpose. He said I had once refused a profitable shortcut on the South End project because 12 tenants would have paid the price. Thomas wrote, "I am not choosing you because you married Simone. I am choosing you because you argued with me when you thought I was wrong, and because you never once asked what agreeing with me would be worth." I remembered him eating barbecue with my crew from a paper tray, asking a mason what the brick needed instead of telling him. My eyes burned before I reached the next line. The letter did not make me powerful in the way Vivian feared. It made me responsible. I issued the 30-day suspension before midnight and requested every valuation. Lender presentation, side letter, fee agreement, and communication connected to Northlake. Martin warned me that the move would become public by morning. I told him it already felt public enough. Simone called at 6:12 the next morning. She did not ask about my face or whether I had slept. She asked what I had done to the sale. I told her Thomas had named me independent steward and that I had exercised the authority exactly as the trust allowed. There was a long silence. Then she said, "You knew about this." I told her I had learned 6 hours earlier. She accused me of hiding something from her family. I reminded her that her mother had tried to make me waive the same authority before anyone told me it existed. Simone said Vivian would never do something like that knowingly. I asked why. Then, the agreement referenced a role the family had spent 3 days refusing to explain. She had no answer, only anger. By 8, Vivian had convened an emergency board call. By 9, a business reporter was asking Eastline whether I was attempting to hijack my wife's family company. By 10, Grant had sent lenders a memo describing the stewardship clause as an obsolete estate planning mechanism being exploited by an aggrieved spouse during a marital dispute. The story spread because it was easy to understand if you removed every fact that made it true. A contractor married a wealthy heiress, got slapped by the matriarch, then discovered a hidden clause and blocked a major deal. I sounded like a man using family drama as leverage. Nobody printing the headlines had seen Thomas's letter or the trust restrictions. I wanted to answer publicly. Denise advised me not to. The trust gave me 30 days. And every hour spent arguing about the insult was an hour Grant could use to move documents or reshape the deal. So I went to work. If Thomas had trusted me to protect the purpose beneath the ownership, I intended to find out exactly what the ownership was being asked to become. The first problem appeared in the valuation. Northlake's offer valued the protected portfolio at $184 million. An independent appraisal commissioned 8 months earlier valued the same buildings at $246 million, even after accounting for affordability covenants. That report was missing from the board presentation. The second problem was Grant's fee. A side letter promised his advisory entity a success payment of $6 million if the transaction closed before the end of the quarter. The fee had been disclosed in a footnote to the compensation committee. But the board materials described him as having no personal financial interest in the timing of the sale. The third problem was worse. Northlake held an option to resell 5 properties immediately to a luxury developer. The option worked only if Whitmore removed tenant protections before closing. Those protections could not vanish by management memo. Grant's team had drafted board resolutions calling them obsolete operating restrictions, a route that would still require steward review once the clause activated. I showed the documents to Martin and Denise. Martin looked older after reading them. He said Thomas had designed the stewardship clause for exactly this kind of situation. but he had never expected Vivian to be the person pushing it through. I asked whether she knew about Grant's fee or the resale option. He said the records did not prove that yet. I did not want to assume the worst simply because Vivian had hit me. Anger is useful for recognizing that a line has been crossed. It is terrible evidence for deciding why. I authorized a forensic review of the transaction data and asked Martin to notify the board that the special shareholder hearing would take place in 3 weeks. Simone moved out 2 days later. She packed while I was at a school renovation site and left a message saying she needed space from what I was doing to her family. In the closet, one pair of white sneakers remained on the floor, scuffed from the first site she had ever visited with me. I sat on the edge of the bed and understood how far we had traveled from those shoes. I called her anyway. I told her I was not asking her to choose between me and her mother. I was asking her to decide whether facts still mattered when they embarrassed someone she loved. Simone said facts could be arranged to tell any story. I answered that signatures, bank transfers, and purchase options were not arranging themselves. For the next week, we barely spoke. Eastline became collateral damage. 2 private clients delayed contract awards because they did not want to be attached to the Whitmore dispute. A lender asked whether my stewardship role created conflicts with our existing credit agreement. 43 employees began hearing rumors that I was about to lose the company. I held a meeting in our equipment yard before sunrise. Diesel hung in the cold air while 43 employees stood between trucks, listening harder than people listen when their mortgages depend on the answer. I told them what I legally could and promised Eastline's payroll would not become leverage in a family fight. If I had to sell my own equity first, I would. One of my oldest foremen, Curtis Bell, waited until everyone else left. He had worked with me since our second truck. He said, "You know what they're counting on, right? They're counting on you getting tired of looking difficult." I laughed once because he had managed to summarize 10 days of lawyers and headlines in a single sentence. The forensic team found the first direct link between Grant and Northlake on day 9. 18 months earlier, an LLC owned by Grant's brother had received a $1.2 million market research payment from a Northlake affiliate. The invoice listed demographic work that another consulting firm had already completed under a separate contract. More payments followed. None went directly to Grant. But the pattern was difficult to explain as coincidence. The team traced 3 entities, 2 family connections, and a chain of reimbursements tied to properties scheduled for sale. We still needed evidence showing Grant had influenced the valuation or concealed information from the board. The evidence came from an unexpected place. Simone emailed me at 2:03 in the morning with no subject line and 1 attachment, then immediately copied her newly retained attorney. It was a draft board presentation from 6 months earlier. In deleted comments, Thomas's former CFO asked why the independent appraisal had vanished. Grant replied, "Vivian wants a clean number. Remove it." I called Simone immediately. She answered on the first ring but did not speak. I asked where she found the file. She said it was in an archived strategy folder Grant had asked her to clear before the hearing. Then, in a voice I barely recognized, she said she had been the one who approved moving the final presentation into the board package. She told me Grant had said the appraisal was outdated and Vivian had agreed. Simone had trusted them. I asked whether she knew about the side fee. She said no. The resale option? No. The payments to Grant's brother? No. I could hear her breathing on the line, slow and uneven, as the difference between being involved and being informed began to open beneath her. I did not tell her she should have listened to me. I wanted to. There are moments when being right offers itself to you like a weapon, and using it feels almost justified. Instead, I asked whether she had other archived drafts. She said yes. I told her to preserve everything exactly as it was and send copies to her own attorney before she sent anything else to me. That mattered because Simone was not suddenly on my side. She had potential exposure as a corporate officer, and I was still her husband in a marriage that was coming apart. If I wanted the truth to survive scrutiny, I could not be the man directing what evidence she saved or how she described it. Denise agreed and documented the boundary. By the following week, Vivian's position had begun to crack. The board's audit committee hired outside counsel after the payments to Grant's brother were disclosed. Northlake postponed its financing deadline. Grant stopped appearing beside Vivian at public events. For the first time since Thomas died, the machinery around her was no longer moving in one direction. Then Grant made his move. A reporter published excerpts from private messages between Simone and me, selected to make it appear that I had threatened to destroy the Whitmore name unless she supported my stewardship authority. The messages were real, but sentences had been removed between the excerpts. The full exchange said the opposite. In the complete conversation, I had written, "I will not protect the Whitmore name by helping anyone hide what happened. If the facts damage the name, the answer is to fix the conduct, not attack the facts." Grant's leak cut the first sentence after the word name. By lunchtime, I was being described as vindictive and unstable. Simone called me furious. But this time, the anger was not aimed at me. She had shared those messages only with Grant and Vivian during an internal strategy discussion. Vivian denied leaking them. Grant denied it too. Simone told me she finally understood why every conversation with him seemed to leave someone else holding the consequences. That evening, she came to the house for the first time since moving out. She sat at the kitchen table where we had once planned vacations and mortgage payments and told me the part I had not known. For almost a year, Grant had been telling her that Eastline was limiting her future, that my unwillingness to scale proved I resented her family's success. He had also been telling Vivian that I wanted control of Whitmore assets through Simone. To me, he had presented the family as people who needed my silence. Each version was slightly different, and each one fed the insecurity already present. He had not created every fracture in our marriage, but he had learned exactly where to press. I asked Simone whether there had been anything between them. She looked directly at me and said no. Not physically and not romantically. Then she added that she had trusted his judgment more than mine for months. And she understood that betrayal could exist before an affair ever did. That answer was harder to dismiss because it did not ask me to minimize it. She apologized for the ballroom, not for failing to stop the slap, which happened too quickly, but for what she chose after it. "I sent you away because confronting her would have cost me the room," she said. And I chose the room. I felt the old heat in my cheek. Then something quieter. The apology did not erase the moment, but at least it finally named the betrayal correctly. We sat in silence after that. I could see she wanted to ask whether understanding changed anything between us. I was not ready to answer. I told her the hearing came first and that she needed separate counsel. She nodded, stood, and left without touching me. For once, neither of us tried to repair a crack before we knew how deep it went. 3 days before the hearing, the outside audit committee found evidence that Grant had altered a valuation summary and routed at least 2 consulting payments through related entities. Northlake formally withdrew from the acquisition. That should have ended the immediate crisis. It did not, because Vivian announced she still intended to challenge my authority and remove the stewardship clause. Her argument was simple. Thomas had been ill when he amended the trust, and giving power to his daughter's husband was evidence of impaired judgment. Martin looked physically ill when he read the filing. He had supervised the execution himself, along with 2 physicians and an independent trust officer. Vivian was now attacking the competence of the husband she had spent 42 years beside. I understood then that the hearing was no longer only about a bad transaction. It was about whether a family could rewrite a dead man's choices because those choices had become inconvenient. I told Denise I wanted every part of the presentation grounded in documents, not emotion. If Vivian wanted a public fight, I would not give her one she could dismiss as wounded pride. The special shareholder review filled the same conservatory where she had slapped me. I had not chosen the location. The board secretary had, because it was the only Whitmore-controlled venue available on short notice. Still, when I walked beneath the chandeliers again, I could feel the exact place on my cheek where her hand had landed. Vivian sat at the front beside her legal team. Simone sat 3 rows back with separate counsel. Grant was absent on advice of his attorneys, representatives from the trust company, the audit committee, Northlake, Eastline's lender, and several minority shareholders filled the room. This time nobody was holding champagne. Martin opened with the trust instrument. He showed that Thomas had executed the amendment while medically competent, witnessed by independent counsel, 2 doctors, and a fiduciary officer with no connection to me. He showed the sealed appointment procedure and the 3 activation conditions. My name had not been revealed to anyone in the family until the clause triggered. That single fact dismantled the claim that I had manipulated Thomas for power. I could not have lobbied for an office I did not know existed. Then Denise presented the postnuptial agreement Vivian had tried to make me sign. Its waiver language matched the stewardship provisions almost word for word, despite the family's earlier claim that those provisions were not applicable. Martin then described the waiver process, but he did not reveal private legal advice he had given Vivian. The trust company produced its own notice file, the waiver request. The stewardship language it quoted, Martin's written warning that the request could trigger review, and Vivian's signed instruction to proceed. A court order permitted testimony about those transaction facts, not privileged strategy. The room changed after that. Until then, Vivian had been able to describe the slap as emotion and the waiver as routine planning. Together, they looked different. Pressure first, humiliation second, and a legal document designed to remove an authority she hoped I would never learn I possessed. I watched her realize the sequence was now visible to everyone. I spoke last. I did not begin with Vivian or Simone. I began with the South End buildings and the families who still lived there. I showed photographs from before the restoration, construction records from the 18 months we spent saving the structures, and Thomas's approval of the affordability covenants that North Lake's resale option required the company to break. Then I presented the independent appraisal, Grant's hidden success fee, the resale option, the payments to his brother's company, and the altered valuation summary. Each item had a date, an author, and a source. I asked the audit committee chair to explain what was confirmed and what remained under investigation. I wanted the line between proof and suspicion to stay visible. Finally, Martin read Thomas's letter about why he chose me. When he reached the sentence about arguing with Thomas when I thought he was wrong, I looked at Vivian. Her expression changed. Not into defeat, exactly, but into recognition. She had spent years assuming Thomas's respect for me was sentimental. The letter showed it had been judgment. Vivian asked to speak. No one stopped her. She stood without notes and said she had believed protecting the family meant controlling what could embarrass it. She admitted ordering the waiver after learning an unnamed steward could interfere with the sale. She said she had not known I was the appointee, but she had known she was trying to neutralize whoever Thomas had trusted. Then Vivian turned toward me. I was wrong about the sale, she said. The room waited so quietly I could hear a camera shutter from the back wall. She looked at Simone, then at me, and I was wrong when I said you were not good enough for my daughter. For once, she did not decorate the apology with explanations. I let the silence stay there long enough for the words to cost her something. I told her the sentence had never been hers to decide. I said the harder question was whether Simone and I had still been good for each other, and that answer belonged only to us. Then I asked the board to preserve the protected portfolio, remove Grant from all authority pending the investigation, and create an independent review of every related party transaction from the previous 3 years. The resolutions passed. Vivian abstained on the vote, removing Grant, and voted in favor of the independent review. North Lake's withdrawal became permanent. The affordability covenants stayed in place. The audit later found enough evidence of concealed fees and falsified internal records for civil claims and a criminal referral, though I let the investigators decide what happened after that. Vivian resigned as executive chair 2 weeks later. She remained a beneficiary of the family trust but gave up operational control. The board selected an interim chair from outside the family, which may have been the healthiest decision anyone named Whitmore had made in years. Martin stayed as trust counsel long enough to oversee the transition, then retired. Simone and I did not reconcile because a hearing went well. Real life rarely respects that kind of timing. We started counseling, lived separately for 6 months, and said things we should have said years earlier. She admitted she had spent so long trying to earn her mother's approval that she had begun grading our marriage with the same scale. I admitted my part too. I had confused endurance with communication. I had let contempt pass because I wanted to believe calm people were automatically strong people. They are not. Sometimes strength is naming the thing early enough that everyone still has a chance to change it. By the time I learned that, Simone and I had a great deal to rebuild. We eventually decided not to rebuild the marriage. There was no affair to expose, and no final villainous act that made the choice easy. We still cared about each other, which made signing the papers feel less like victory than accepting a structure could be too damaged to restore safely. We divided what was ours fairly, shook hands outside the courthouse, and did not pretend history guaranteed a future. A year later, East Line opened a training center inside one of the South End buildings we had restored with Thomas. Whitmore Heritage funded the classroom equipment under a new community investment policy approved by the independent board. The first cohort included 26 apprentices studying masonry, electrical work, project supervision, and preservation trades. Vivian came to the opening. She did not ask to stand beside me for photographs. She sat in the second row and listened while two tenants described what staying in the neighborhood had meant to their families. Afterward, she found me near the loading entrance and said Thomas would have liked the program. I told her I thought so too. She touched the fingers of her right hand as if remembering the ballroom, then said, "I am sorry for that night." I told her I believed she was. I did not tell her it was forgotten, because it was not forgiveness. I had learned was not restoration to a previous condition. Sometimes it was simply the decision that another person's worst act would not become the address where you kept living. I still drive to job sites before sunrise. I still wear boots to meetings when I have been on a site that morning. The Whitmore board has never asked me to become an executive, and I have never wanted the job. I remain independent steward for the protected assets, a role designed to be quiet unless someone tries to make purpose disappear behind a profitable spreadsheet. The leather folder from the gala sits in a locked cabinet in my office beside Thomas's letter. One document was written to make me surrender authority I did not know I had. The other explained why someone had trusted me with it in the first place. I keep both because together they remind me how differently people can measure the same man. If Vivian's slap taught me anything, it was not that humiliation can be reversed by discovering hidden power. Power was never the answer. The answer was that worth does not become real when a lawyer confirms it, a board recognizes it, or a wealthy family finally apologizes. It was real when I was standing in dust with a crew, doing work I could defend. Thomas understood that before I did. He did not make me good enough by putting my name in a trust. He simply left a mechanism that forced everyone else to look at the evidence when the moment came. And once the noise was gone, the evidence was ordinary, promises kept, shortcuts refused, people protected, and work finished the right way. So when I think about that ballroom now, I do not remember the slap first. I remember the phone ringing in the parking court and Martin telling me not to sign anything. The call did not make me worthy, and Thomas's trust did not create my value. It only forced a powerful family to measure me by evidence instead of status. I had been enough long before any lawyer said my name,